All right, I'm on page 37 in our history book, and this is the book that looks like that, okay? And be sure you listen to the first video. I'm going to kind of just tell you about this, okay? And then you're expected to read it on your own or have mommy read it to you. You're expected to read it and to memorize some of the terms, and then you'll take a quiz after this. After this video, after you've watched this video, and after you've read, and after you think you're ready, then you'll have a quiz. And for your quizzes and your tests, I'm trusting that you don't use your book. Now you can for your reading, but for your history, your sciences, I'm asking that you don't use your books when you take a test. So be sure you have, so be sure you've read it and yet that you're ready. Okay. We're on page 37. We're learning that the Sioux Indian tribe, and I know it's spelled very unusually, but the Sioux Indian tribe lived in the center part of the United States, so around Kansas, Nebraska, and around in that area. It's a very flat land. It has the Platte River runs through there, and the river is kind of meanders. In other words, it's not a fast river. It's kind of a slow meandering river, which is exactly what the buffalo loves. The buffalo, there's lots of grass for the buffalo to eat, there's lots of water for the buffalo to drink, and lots of grazing land, lots of sleeping land. And so to the buffalo, this is the very best place to be. It's called the Great Plains, or the Central Plains, because it's just plain. In other words, there's no tall mountains, there's no valleys and pits, there's just pretty much plain. All right. So the buffalo was, to the Sioux Indians, the buffalo was absolutely everything. The buffalo was important for all of their life. First of all, to eat. The buffalo was a large animal, and it could feed a lot of people, but because they didn't have refrigeration, the meat didn't last very long. And so they would, I don't know why in particular they didn't just use jerky, although maybe sometimes they did. But one of their delicacies was to take the buffalo meat and mix it with some cherry juice. I think choke cherries were prevalent in that area. And they would use some cherry juice and some fat, and they'd kind of make it into a hamburger patty kind of idea by smashing. And then they'd pat it out, and they would dry it in the sun. And they would use that like we would use jerky. They put it in their satchels or in their pockets or whatever. And when they went on the hunt, then they had a pemmican to eat, and to them it was it was a delicacy, and it was a way of life. Everyone had pemmican. It wasn't like everyone had it. So that was the only way they could use up all of the buffalo. And as you know, Indians were not much into wasting anything. They used every smidgen of everything. And so they didn't waste buffalo. They just didn't kill it because they wanted to and leave it. They actually used it. And the buffalo were kind of nomads. And so they would, in other words, they wouldn't just stay in one area all their lives. They were always traveling. They were always moving to where there was better grass or fresher grass or whatever. And so they would move, and whenever they would move, the Sioux Indians would have to pack up their stuff and move with them because they needed the buffalo. And the buffalo is kind of it can be kind of a mean animal, really. And you have to be sure that you don't get too close to a buffalo. So, like if you ever go to Yellowstone National Park, there's some mini buffalo there, but you don't want to get too close to a buffalo. They're kind of temperamental. So one of the things that, in ways in which they're like a cow, even though I think their meat tastes similar to cow meat, is that they are. They're afraid. They're afraid of loud noises. They're afraid of thunder. They're afraid of yelling and whooping and whatever. And so these Indians knew that, and they never wanted to stampede a buffalo unless it was for a purpose. So the buffalo, they were quite around buffalo because the buffalo stampede was very dangerous. Now, they had some kind of interesting things. They had some little cliffs where they could get the buffalo to running in a stampede, and the buffalo would just plunge headlong down and actually fall and die at the bottom of the little cliff. And then they'd pick up the buffalo. It didn't have to even shoot an arrow. Buffalo just kind of killed itself. And so, that worked to their advantage. But mostly they kept the buffalo calm. Now, they weren't like the cowboys. The cowboys sang to their to their cows to to be sure that the cows were kind of calm and, that kind of thing. But the Indians, I don't know if they sang to their buffalo or not. I don't think they were as close as the cowboys were to their cows. The Indians stayed a ways away from the buffalo because they knew that, that's where a buffalo is a wild animal, whereas a cow was more of a tame animal. So they stayed away from the buffalo, but not so far away that they couldn't get to it. These Indians were not farmers. They did not have things that you would grow from a garden. They did not have corn. They did not have pumpkins or squash or anything like that. They didn't have other animals. This is not the place for the deer, the moose, and the elk. And those are more forested animals, and there were no forests here. There was, well, you can see the picture there on page 37. It doesn't look like forest at all, does it? A few trees here and there, but pretty much plain, and not any places where a deer or moose and elk could hide. So they weren't there. So it was only the buffalo. And yes, they did have smaller animals, probably some rabbits and groundhogs and that kind of thing, but nothing as large and as tasty as buffalo meat. And they couldn't really gather wild things. There were some bulbs. There were some little camas bulbs, which taste kind of like a wild onion. There were a few things like that. The choke cherries grew there. But for the most part, they ate buffalo day in, day out. Now, they took the hide off the buffalo, and the buffalo hide was very thick, and they would use it for blankets. It was very hairy, and they would take the hair off of the buffalo and wind it and make ropes and that kind of thing. They would take the hide off and make their teepees, which is what they lived in. You can see that on page 38. And Daddy, are you there? Yes. Can you take the brownies out of the oven? Yes. And turn the timer off? So you can see the teepees right there on page 38. And, those Indian ladies, just like all ladies everywhere, were into decorating. And it's kind of interesting seeing the decorations that they made on their teepees. They would burn parts into it, and they would take colored juices and make designs and whatever. I guess wherever a girl is, she's always into the decorating mode. Just like if you look at girls' lockers at school, lots of times the girls' lockers are decorated. They have a mirror, and sometimes they have a whiteboard and a pen and pictures of their family, and just decorations. I've seen some that had little chandeliers in their locker, and all kinds of stuff. So these Indian ladies were exactly the same. So they built their teepees out of poles, and that was the trick. The buffalo hide was hard enough, but finding poles in a place where the trees aren't really growing that much was very difficult. But they found poles, and they would keep these poles all of their lives. You started with poles and you died with the same poles. So they would use those poles over and over again. And because they needed to follow the buffalo, they lived in teepees, which they could take up and take down. Kind of like even when we're studying with Moses in the wilderness. I mean, those people, they weren't staying, they were moving all the time, so they lived in tents. And so that's kind of how these people were. They were moving all the time, so they lived in teepees. They were quick up and quick down. You can see the picture on page 38. It looks like they've hired some wild dogs, and these were part dog and part wolf, and they really weren't a tame pet per se, but tame-ish. Okay, and they would take the dogs, and the dogs would pull a sled, or sometimes they would lay the sticks down and pile everything on the sticks and wind the sticks together. Or sometimes they would take the bones of a buffalo. A buffalo has you can imagine, a large rib cage, and they would use that kind of like a sled, and they would put everything on there, and the dogs would help pull all their belongings from place to place to place. The Indians wore. They ate buffalo. They used buffaloes for their teepees, and they also wore buffalo. And it was a colder area than the Cherokee, and so they needed more clothes. And the buffalo skin, the buffalo hide, was a very, very appropriate and very. It was a good choice for clothes because it was very thick. and to wear buffalo clothes they were very serviceable. So you didn't have to have many outfits, so to speak. They made their moccasins out of buffalo. They used, like I said, they used every part of him. They used his insides. They used his horns for cups. They used his insides. They would take the intestines, which is like a case, and they would clean out the case, and then that case was very tough, and they would use that for rope or for string. And anyway, they would fasten their arrows to the shaft of the arrow, the point of the arrow, by using these strings, by using the insides of the buffalo. I mean, they were into their buffalo. They used their tendons, which is also a strong piece of fiber in your body, and they used everything. The buffalo was important to this tribe. On page 39, you can see some of the Indian signs. These Indians spoke, well, of course, they spoke to each other with their words, not English words, but their Sioux Indian language. But they also had a sign language that they used, and you can see some of the signs there, like that one there meant, or I guess that one there meant friend. So when they were from tribe to tribe, they could communicate. So these Indians had actually a sign language that they used, and one of the first tribes that we know of that used signs to make themselves known. On page 39, you also can see the Indian there. That's the chief. That was the head of the Indian tribe. And he had a whole cap full of feathers. And the feathers were for courageous things, brave things that this chief had done. And he would get a feather. And some of the chiefs had their whole hat was full of feathers, plus clear down, like a train, like a bridle. When a bride gets married, sometimes she has a long train on her dress. That's the way these Indian chiefs, they would have done so many brave things in their lifetime that they would have all these gigantic, a whole headdress full of feathers. And it was called a war bonnet. And usually the things that they got had to do with battles, with overtaking somebody or whatever. So anyway, their war bonnet was usually very beautiful, full of all these feathers that they had earned. Kind of like if you go to Awana, you earn patches and badges, or you go even to Cub Scouts or Boy Scouts, you do the same thing. Well, in the Indian world, this is what they did. All right, so you need to know those things, and be sure you read your chapter. It's just a couple pages, page 37 through 39, and it's just a few paragraphs. Be sure you read that. I'm not going to quiz you on the pink page there. I'm just going to quiz you on page 37 through 39. So go ahead and be sure you read it. Be sure you're ready for your quiz. And as soon as you're ready, then you can take your quiz. Okay, bye-bye.